thank you again, everyone, for being here today. As I said earlier, this is Launching Your Legal Career with an LGBTQ plus legal fellowship. We have a fantastic panel here today that has some really great information to help demystify this process. So thank you for being here. If you're interested in taking notes, please note that this webinar will be recorded, and a few days from now, I will send the recording to everyone who's registered. So you will be able to view this again. If you miss anything, there also will be the opportunity for question and answer at the end. So if you do have any questions, you're welcome to use the Q&A feature here on Zoom, and our panelists will get to that at the end of the webinar. Just to quickly introduce myself and the bar before we get started, I want to take a minute to let you know that my name is Mari Nemec. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I serve as advocacy counsel at the National LGBTQ plus Bar Association and Foundation. The National LGBTQ plus Bar is a nationwide network of legal professionals and affiliated organizations dedicated to promoting justice and equity for the diverse LGBTQ plus community through advocacy, education, and collaboration within the legal profession. We have programming and resources for prospective, incoming, and current law students, in addition to legal professionals, and we're here to support you every step of the way in your legal career. I particularly want to highlight that our annual Lavender Law Conference and Career Fair will be this July 13th through 15th in Chicago, Illinois. It is a fantastic event. As far as we know, it's the largest LGBTQ plus legal conference in the world. 3 days of fantastic programming, including a great career fair. So if you're able to make it to Chicago, we would love to see you. You can register for that at lgbtqbar.org/annual. And with that, I'm happy to hand it off to our panelists to get us started.
Thank you, Mari, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We really appreciate you taking the time to be a part of today's webinar on postgrad LGBTQ public interest fellowships. But before we begin the substance of the program, we'll just start with brief introductions. My name is Donovan Bandana, he, him, and I am a legal fellow at GLBTQ Legal Advocates and Defenders, or GLAD Law in Boston, and I am a Lyman Law Fellow, which is a law school funded fellowship. And I'll pass it to Angela.
Great, thanks, Donovan. Hi, everybody. My name is Angela Liu. I use she, her pronouns. I am also at GLAD Law alongside Donovan, but I am a Constitutional Law Fellow, which is an internally funded fellowship at GLAD Law. And I'll pass it to Alex.
Hey everyone, thanks for being here. I'm Alex, she, her pronouns, and I'm a Skadden Fellow at the ACLU LGBTQ and HIV Project. And I'll pass it to Luna, who I believe leads off the next slide.
Hi, my name is Luna Isaiah Floyd. I use they or he pronouns. I'm an Equal Justice Works Fellow at Lambda Legal, doing an externally funded project with their youth and out-of-home care project. Go for it, Charlie.
I use they them pronouns, and I am the Daniel Renberg Fellow at Lambda Legal, which is an internally funded position.
Glad to talk us through what is a fellowship. If you're here, you probably have some idea, but just to walk through the basics. A fellowship is one of the primary gateways into an entry-level public interest employment at legal nonprofits like the ones that we are at. There are other paths, obviously, to a career in public interest law, but this is frequently the way the folks get their foot in the door. They tend to be term-limited positions, usually 1 or 2 years, and often with a focus on a specific project. We'll get more into that later. This is typically more true of externally funded fellowships, which is to say you are funded by someone that is not your host organization, at least primarily, as compared to internally funded fellowships where the funding comes from your host organization. Depending on your organization, you can be treated as functionally a junior staff attorney. You could be working exclusively on your project or on a wider range of things. It really varies. Glad to go to the next slide. So just to distill it into some clear takeaways, fellowships typically have a fellowship project. This might be, setting up a medical legal partnership or bringing novel types of claims on behalf of certain groups. You do so at your host organization. For me, that's the ACLU. And you, at least for externally funded fellowships, will have a funder or a sponsor. The 3 primary ones are listed there. Luna?
All right. So there are a couple of different routes to getting a fellowship and getting it funded. that we're going to walk through today. The first route is one, it is actually going to be Charlie and Angela.
The introduction to that. So first, we're talking through internally funded fellowships, which are the simplest process of getting a fellowship. You would apply to it like any other job. You find the job listing, apply, hopefully get it, and then you're done. You're good to go. The downside to internally funded fellowships is that there's not that many of them. So you're most likely going to have to be looking for funding. So, Angela, what did I miss?
Oh, I think you got pretty much everything there. I just wanted to share a few insights about applying to internally funded fellowships. I'm going to talk a little bit more about my process later. I applied almost exclusively to internally funded fellowships. So I've interviewed for several of them and just wanted to give a note, I guess, about internally funded fellowships. They are, at different organizations, they all have different kinds of processes that you'll go through. And the ones I interviewed for all had very different ones. So just, I guess, a note or a flag for folks who are considering them. I had one interview that required legal research in advance and then presenting orally at a presentation that was on Zoom with attorneys who were at that organization. I had another one where they kind of had a skills test during the interview where they asked you a question, and then you have to kind of prepare on the spot. I've had some that had one round of interviews, some that had many. So they kind of run the gamut. Even though the process is different than securing funding, like they kind of vary in what the interview process will look like. And I would encourage folks who are applying for these to be very familiar with your application materials, because in one of my interviews, they asked a pretty detailed question about my writing sample that I was not prepared for. So just make sure that you're familiar with your materials when you're going into one of these kinds of interviews.
All right, here we go. So the second route you can take to getting your fellowship secured and funded is getting external funding. This is a pretty common route to get to getting funding, but it's kind of a double application process usually, where you find your host organization either just through folks you know and have worked with before or through job applications. And then you work with your host organization to come up with a kind of self-contained project that you take responsibility for that you're excited about. Some organizations, you pitch them a project and they're like, that sounds great, let's do this. And some organizations are like, there are some things we need our new fellow to do. But once you have a project proposal put together, you apply for funding with one of a couple of different funding organizations. And the main three are Equal Justice Works, Skadden, and Justice Catalyst. I went through Equal Justice Works. It's very common to apply to all three. In fact, I would heavily recommend you apply to all three. But both Equal Justice Works and Skadden are pairing you with a law firm or other big company to essentially pay your salary to your organization for 2 years. Justice Catalyst is a little different. Sometimes it's 1 year, sometimes it's 2 years. But overall, it's a way to get your project in front of people who want to give you money to do this project. So there's a lot of moving parts, but it's not an unmanageable process if you start planning early. Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, happy to talk through, I guess, the Skadden process specifically. Like Luna said, you workshop your project with your host organization while you apply. So even if you pitch them something in your interview, you have to refine it much more aggressively during the Skadden or EJW or whatever application process. For Skadden, at least, this looks like an essay about what your project actually is, an essay about previous public interest experiences that are probably related to your project. I think a third essay that is just personal to you, etc. So you have a detailed conception of what it looks like and what you might be able to accomplish in 2 years if you get the funding. The next stage would be an interview for Skadden. It's with the director of the Skadden Foundation and then a partner at the firm, which changes year to year, person to person. You don't know who your partner will be. So something I think is interesting about the interview process is that you're speaking during the Skadden interview with someone who's intimately familiar with public interest work and also a partner who might have no familiarity with public interest work at all, let alone your specific issue area, let alone your specific project. So you're doing sort of two kinds of communication there. The Skadden process is very clean. After the interview, you will get a notification if you are a finalist or not, and then shortly after that, you will be notified if you are selected for the fellowship. The application sort of decreases, or the pool decreases by about 50% at every stage. So you go, I think, from 28 fellows to 56 finalists to 100 or so interviews, 200 or so applications. And I found those numbers helpful when I was applying.
Just to go back to the Equal Justice Works process, to go into a little more detail, Equal Justice Works operates really similarly. The applications, if you end up doing both of them, they're not quite the same application, but they're very similar. You apply at a very similar time. Equal Justice Works is a little less focused on your personal achievements and more focused on the project. In my experience, Skadden was a little bit more like, tell us about how impressive you are, and Equal Justice Works was a little more, tell us exactly how you will implement your project. And Justice Catalyst is none of us have Justice Catalyst, or I think none of us know anyone who has Justice Catalyst, which doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It is a great funding organization, and we're really glad that they fund these projects, but we're a little less familiar with the application process. Justice Catalyst has an interesting first step where you submit what's called a prospectus, which is kind of an abbreviated version of the application process for the other two funders. And then they will kind of let you know whether they think that they might be interested in funding your project or not before you go through the entire application process. And then just to say one more thing about Equal Justice Works interview process, they start interviewing after Skadden finishes giving offers, and then they will, if you're selected for an interview, they will put you in front of one Equal Justice Works person and then a team of attorneys from the law firm or organization that is trying to sponsor a fellowship. So it's primarily pitching to people who might not know anything about the work you do. We'll talk about it later. My project was very focused on trans youth and foster care, and the people I interviewed with did not have a ton of background knowledge about that. So I kind of had to start from zero. Thanks for letting me kind of circle around getting all those points in. I appreciate it, but I think we can move to the next slide.
Awesome. And last but not least, we have the school-funded route. So a law school-funded public interest fellowship is funding provided directly by the law school, usually to support a graduating student or recently graduated alumni to do public interest legal work after graduation. And similar to internal funded fellowships, like these can really vary in terms of structure and substance. So some law schools offer project-based fellowships, which are similar to the Equal Justice Works and Skadden process, where you work with your host organization to design a legal project and submit that to the law school. But there are also some fellowships where it's just organization-based, where applicants don't necessarily need to design their own project and can receive funding to serve as like a junior staff attorney. Timing for the law school funded projects are usually later in the cycle. So in my experience, most people I know who applied to fellowships would often apply to internally funded and externally funded fellowships first. And then law school fellowships typically have application deadlines, usually at the beginning of 3L spring. The con to that is that, you get a little bit more nervous as graduation day starts approaching. But I highly encourage folks who do want to apply for a law school funded fellowship to try to secure sort of internal or external funding first. Really, with law school funded fellowships, it's really important to meet with the fellowship advisor. I'd say try to meet with them at the beginning of 3L just to express your interest in applying for the fellowship. You can talk about your ideas for a project and workshop it with them. And I think something really helpful to do is if it's okay to ask them to review your application ahead of time, just because that they are going to be the ones to likely be deciding on who gets these fellowship, and also can talk to former alumni who did that fellowship as well. I'll also say it could be the case that even after you receive a law school funded fellowship, should you get sort of an externally funded fellowship like Equal Justice Works, I think many law schools are okay with you withdrawing after accepting a school funded fellowship, because that means that they just have more money to give to other students. So even if you have accepted a law school funded fellowship and there's still an opportunity to apply for internal or external funding, I would highly encourage that as well.
So next, I think we're going to get into the timeline. So I'm sure the audience here is probably at various stages of your law school career, but I think kind of the time that many people start thinking about fellowships more seriously is as rising 2Ls. So at the summer after your 1L year. So these are some tips for what you might want to do to prepare. If you don't do all of them, I certainly did not do all of them, but they can put you in a good position for when you're actually starting your applications. So starting off is to get to know kind of the people who are doing the job that you want. I think that's very helpful in terms of getting a sense of whether this is an organization that you want to work with, whether this is the type of work, substantive work that you want to do as an attorney. And in my experience, and I'm sure others have also experienced this, people are often pretty receptive, even if you have not had previous contact with them. Sometimes it's maybe easier to go through alumni networks through your law school, but I've even had experience just going on LinkedIn and seeing somebody and messaging them. And sometimes they, actually, I've had pretty decent success with them setting up a call, and they're usually pretty happy to talk about their work. So would encourage that. And yet, as part of that, speaking with folks, you might get a sense of which kinds of organizations you would really want to work with. So if you have a sense of that, then you can do more targeted outreach and get a better sense of what kind of work they do, what the organizational culture is like, et cetera. So the way that you might describe this maybe is networking, which I think sounds scarier for people than it really is. I think making friends professionally is maybe a softer and more accurate way of putting it. Like if there are people who you really vibe with, you might want to stay in touch with them. You might come across them organically, even if it's not through cold emailing, and you might want to stay in touch as a result. And I think throughout my experience, my professional experience, sometimes people just end up staying in touch because you get along, and that, I guess, is like an aspect of networking that you might not consciously put in that bucket. So that is something to keep in mind. And as Mari mentioned earlier, if possible, Lavender Law is a really great way to meet people. It's the largest conference that focuses on LGBTQ and legal related issues. So I did not get a chance to go during law school, but I think that based on everything I've heard about it, it would have been a really great experience. So anyone have anything to add?
One plug. Lavender Law. One of the summer 1L, because I was fortunate that my law school, there was someone who had donated money. Which, by the way, for anyone of folks on this call, you should be emailing your admin about getting funding to go to conferences like this. I think if you send enough angry emails, anyone will find you. But I was very fortunate that, being at Lavender Law was this amazing experience where I basically got to meet a bunch of my heroes and basically every single LGBT litigator in the country at once. It was a wonderful experience. And I'm 100% certain that connections that I made there is what led to my 2L summer internship, which was just like a really transformative and wonderful experience, like my dream internship. So I know it's like a little hectic to travel, especially as you're doing your own internships this summer, but truly like Lavender Law is a very special place to be and really helpful for future career stuff.
I just want to second that for the Trans Law Institute, especially, which is a part of Lavender Law. It was a huge deal for me after 1L to see trans attorneys doing the things that I wanted to be doing. And that really gave me the courage to be more out in law school, to really pursue advocacy for trans folks as an out trans person, much more, I don't know, in a much more complete way.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Charlie and Luna.
All right, we're back to me. So let's talk a little bit about you finished 2L, now what? You start thinking about jobs. All of your friends are at summer associate positions that might turn into jobs, and you're just starting the process, and that's okay. It is okay to not have a job at the very first moment you could possibly have a job. Um, so as so in the spring of 2L, you should finish scoping out organizations you'd like to work with, intern with who you can, work with folks through clinics wherever you can, figure out what personalities mesh with yours, what orgs mesh with your idea of social justice, and make a list of a few organizations you really want to target. The interesting thing about spring of 2L, and we'll talk about this a little later, is that the fellowship and clerkship timeline are on a very similar track, because you should be starting to apply for clerkships in May and June, and then June and July is when you should be trying to find and secure a host organization. So all of the connections you've made to people in the LGBT legal movement in the last step, you should be saying, hey, I want to do this kind of project potentially. Where should I bring it? What do you think? Refine. And I got really lucky. And I'll talk about this a little more in a couple of slides, but a past supervisor was like, just propose a project to work with me. And so I did that. But I also had the experience of looking for job listings on Idealist, and it's the public service. So the name of the job board will come to me, I promise. And so I was also applying for externally funded PSJD, thank you. PSJD is a great resource for finding public interest jobs and also fellowship opportunities for externally funded fellows, which are basically just organizations going, hey, please propose a project, we'll work with you on the funding. And then once you have that kind of secured, start writing and editing your funding applications. And that is a whole nother can of worms that I think when you get to that point, you can feel free to reach out to me and I will advise you as best I can. But it can be a little bit of an overwhelming process because not only are you writing about yourself, you're writing about the population you're working on behalf of, you're writing about the organization you want to join, and you're coming up with a legal strategy that is going to kind of be your baby for the next couple of years. And then deadlines for Equal Justice Works and Skadden are generally in early September. So you can kind of spend your whole 2L rising 3L summer working on fellowship applications. I know I was really glad that I had a comparatively chiller 2L internship that gave me plenty of time in the evenings to write and refine these applications. Next slide, please. All right. And then, so once we get past September, Skadden does interviews and selections in October and November. You also submit your Justice Catalyst prospectus, I believe, in either I think in late September. And that's the kind of short, are you interested in my project kind of application. Um, and then so in November, Justice Catalyst says, we want you to keep applying for us or we don't. Um, and so the Skadden process is kind of wrapped up by, I believe, the second week of November. And then basically the next week after Skadden decisions come out, Equal Justice Works um, interviews start. So they'll let you know if you are kind of still under consideration or not, if they're planning to try to put you in front of uh, law firms that might want to fund you. Um, but Equal Justice Works also has a really long timeline for getting these law firms and corporations in the room. So they will put you in front of funders anytime between November and March. Some people have one interview with them, some people have multiple. It just really, really depends. And then starting usually after the new year in the spring of your 3L year, school funding applications will open and you can start applying to those. And then the other thing to keep in mind during all of this is that externally funded applications are going to be opening and closing through this whole process, but are often more focused in the winter and spring, more so spring, to start in September. So it's a little bit of a long process. I personally found myself applying to things from like May to November. Um, but it is a doable process. I want to be super clear about that. All right, next slide.
Sorry, I was searching for my unmute button. So next part or next consideration is post-clerkship kind of fellowship. So I clerked after graduating from law school, and then basically around the time that my clerkship was starting, or even a little bit before then, I had to start thinking about applying for a fellowship, which was an interesting position to be in, where your job hasn't started yet and you're already looking for your next job, but such is the name of the game here. So if you're in that position, you kind of follow a similar timeline as what Luna has already laid out. So towards the beginning of the summer, you would be looking for a host organization. And then throughout the summer would be looking for or writing your funding applications. And then for EJW and Skadden, that would be the beginning of September when you submit your funding applications. I think my personal timeline was more because I didn't apply for external funded fellowships, really. I was kind of just looking throughout that summer for internally funded opportunities. And then when my clerkship started at the end of August, I continued to apply for opportunities at that time. So it's kind of like, the beginning, if your timeline is set up such that you have a clerkship immediately following graduation, you should expect that around the time of your clerkship starting, you may also be looking for fellowship opportunities, whether they're externally or internally funded. And then Charlie, did you want to have anything to add?
Just to say that's not necessarily the only timeline if you are plan on doing a fellowship post a clerkship, or if you are doing a first fellowship and then going into a second, which is not a common thing at all, but I do know some folks who are doing it. So the fellowships are not only posted and have to be applied through in the summer. There are other ones that show up throughout the year. There are not many of them. But if that's the case, as you're going through your clerkship or your job, you can also take things a little bit slower, scope out organizations, connect with former fellows and brainstorm projects, and keeping an eye out for other things as they pop up. It's also like possible to connect with folks and come up with a project, kind of like a Luna's experience was, not necessarily applying directly through something, but connecting with someone and talking about maybe applying to funding at a different time. But there's wanting to emphasize that there is some flexibility in the process. Great, and let's talk through some things that can go wrong that you can't avoid. I think the first is not having what has been referred to me as demonstrated interest on your resume. If you're a 1L or getting started in law school and you're like, is there something I can be doing right now? Um, keep in mind like why you came to law school and think about what fellowships you're interested in the future and make sure that your resume reflects that. If you're really interested in doing LGBT work in the long term, but there's not a single thing in your law school experience that reflects that, that's not necessarily something that's going to bar you from a fellowship, but there are a lot of people who do have that on their resume, and it's going to be a little bit harder for you to get there. And also want to acknowledge like this is hard. Not every law school is going to have a long sexuality class, especially in this current moment in time as law schools are capitulating to the current administration. Some law schools have LGBT clinics, which is amazing, but that's only a handful of them. And just want to emphasize, like, there are opportunities that you can seek out that are just beyond what your law school offers. For example, the Williams Institute, which is a policy think tank out of UCLA, hosts a moot court competition every year that is focused specifically on LGBT law. That's actually where Isaiah and I met. That's an opportunity you can do. If you are interested in writing academically, you can propose some sort of idea related to LGBT law for a comment, perhaps. Maybe you have a professor you really like that is doing like some kind of research that's relevant to LGBT law. But try and find something because it's helpful for your applications, but also you want to know that for sure that you want to do this work before you sign on to a fellowship for 2 years and turns out like, oh my gosh, I can't stand the subject area. So if you can, try and make sure that you are supporting yourself there. Other things you should make sure you're doing is you should talk to past fellows. I'm not going to speak for everyone on this call, but I would be surprised if not all of us spoke to someone who was a past fellow who either gave us some really brilliant insight we didn't have or helped advocate for us when we couldn't do it on ourselves. None of us got to the positions that we got to entirely on our own. And it's also really helpful to talk to fellows to understand like what their exact fellowship experience was. Maybe you really want to work for X, Y, and Z org, but they only do policy work and you really do litigation or vice versa. Like it's important to know what kind of fellowship you're walking into. And that's also beneficial because when you get to the interview stage, that shows that you care about the fellowship. So if someone's asking you what you think about how it runs, you can mention like, oh, I talked to Charlie and they said this is how it worked for them. And like, that sounded really interesting to me. So that's a benefit too. We talked about this a little bit, but networking is important, unfortunately. I can say for the whole, though, there are, at least in the LGBT legal field, just some really, really extraordinary and special people. It's obviously good for building your network and understanding, how this world works, but also they're just good people. Come find us. Like, we want to be friends. But having those networks can be really helpful as you're applying to fellowships. Unfortunately, we are in a very elitist profession, and sometimes knowing someone is what's going to get your foot in the door. Other things to keep in mind, you need to have some backup plans. We're going to talk about this in a second, but like all of us apply to a lot of different things, and all of us experience rejection. And you might think that you are the absolute perfect person in the entire country for a fellowship, and you might be really, really qualified for that role. And also, there are things that are completely out of your control that may impact whether or not you get that fellowship. And sometimes it's just bad luck. It's nothing to do with you and nothing you can fix. So knowing like what the dream is really important, but also having like, here are other places that I would be very happy. And it's important to have that in your back pocket. I'd also really recommend talking to your law school's fellowship coordinator. I know that these folks can be real hit or miss, for sure. But they ultimately have been doing this work for a long time, and they do know the ins and outs of things. And I'm cautiously optimistic that you will be able to extract some nuggets of wisdom from them. I'm curious to know if like folks had experiences at their law schools, but I can say at least at mine, the fellowship coordinators were editing people's Skadden essays for them and helping them like build stronger narratives for funding. They can also just push you and think about strategy in different ways. When I was applying for 2L internships, I had the experience where I got an offer from my second choice and I had not heard back from my first choice. And I went to my fellowship coordinator or the career coordinator and said like, I think I'm just going to take it because it feels really like stupid otherwise to gamble. And she talked me through the pros and cons and pushed me to reject the offer and wait for the see if anything happened with the first one. And you know what? It did, and that's amazing. And I'm so glad that it happened. It was a huge gamble, but it was nice having someone in my corner who had that knowledge of how things work to give me some support there. So talk to the folks. Also, make sure you give yourself enough time, especially in August and September, for applying to applications. It is a long process, and there's a lot of things that are going to be on your plate. That being said, I'm of the mindset, other folks may disagree, but I'm of the mindset that law school is a great tool and a great learning experience, but ultimately the point of this is to get you a job. And where you should be placing, in my opinion, where you should be placing your attention and your priorities is getting that job. When that's more or less secure, that's when I want you to go and explore like things you might be interested in, like go down, fun like wormholes. But until then, focus on getting yourself hired because it's quite important. Does anyone have anything else to add to this?
I also found my law school fellowship advisor helpful for mooting for interviews.
Yeah, I think sometimes you can be at this really specific level in your head about how exactly you're going to get your fellowship project off the ground. And a fellowship coordinator can be really helpful in going, but how is that going to work? Like, what are we talking about here? Getting down to a more broad level so that you can appeal to the people who are not public interest folks who are going to be on these funding calls.
Yeah, just to add, to the extent possible, like getting to know folks in the career services office, somebody who you like and can be an advocate for you is very helpful. I don't think I used our fellowship office to the full extent, but they did flag for me because they knew about my interest. They did flag for me the fellowship that I currently have, and they sent it to me, pretty soon after it was posted. So I think just having someone there who is aware of your interests and can elevate opportunities for you, so that you see them early on, can be helpful. And it's something that you can do throughout your law school career. Like your career services office may be helpful for finding internships too, not just fellowships, and depending on how your law school is structured, possibly also clerkships.
All right, I'm gonna talk through my fellowship project experience. You should be able to see, this is my one pager for Skadden, which is something you can do, but you don't have to do, kind of explaining how your project works at a really broad level. So I did all the networking, interned at a bunch of different LGBTQ organizations. So I had that demonstrated interest piece of knowing how LGBTQ law worked. I had some academic interest shown. Um, so in May of 2L, I actually spoke to an undergrad internship supervisor at Lambda Legal about what I should be doing to send around fellowship applications. Where did he think I should send? Where did he think I should propose projects, and what did he think I should propose? And and this was someone who had been a mentor for me like since undergrad. Um, and I was really lucky that he was just like, you want to propose a project with me? Um, it took a long time to get that kind of nailed down organizationally. So I did end up applying for clerkships and other advertised fellowship openings. I believe all of my applications were for internally funded at this point because or externally funded, sorry, externally funded at this point because it was so early in the process. So I applied for clerkships in May, struck out hard, and then kind of went straight into applying for advertised fellowship openings. I got several interviews. I had a whole project pitch of what I wanted to work on, and it's always helpful to go in with an idea of a project you could propose, even if you are pretty sure that the organization is going to have something they want you to work on specifically. It still helps to go in knowing enough about the organization that you could say, I could do this to complement your mission. Um, so in early July of my Rising 3L summer, Lambda confirmed that they could be my host organization, and so we turned straight to the funding applications. Um, I I remember this being a lot of Google Docs, a lot of comments from my future supervisor on how what we wanted to say and how we wanted to say it. Um, but I also connected with some folks at other organizations that would benefit from my project coming to life, and they actually submitted a few support letters to complement my Skadden application. Um, but I applied to all three of these applications, which are all similar but subtly different. Each Equal Justice Works, Skadden, and Justice Catalyst. In October of 3L, I had a Skadden interview and was a finalist. So I was down to, I think it's the final 20, the final 48, and then they cut that in half again and fund 24. I think it's something like that. Um, in early November, it was an interesting week. I got rejected from Skadden, and then Justice Catalyst, where I'd submitted like the short application I was talking about, said that they were not interested in a project like mine. And then I, right away, same week, had my Equal Justice Works interview. So I was a little bit all over the place in early November. And that's very early for an Equal Justice Works interview. Generally speaking, they are later in the process. Um, Late November, December, and then picking back up again in January. The nice thing about Equal Justice Works is that it's a little bit more rolling in terms of they tell you once that funder has decided who they want to fund, then they just tell you. So I got a call from someone at my law firm sponsor. Um, I believe it was late the next week. So I got a call saying that they had chosen me, and then I was done with the funding process. I was really lucky that it was done pretty early, but I did have a pretty wild November in there. Um, but yeah, so my project ended up having to do with supporting trans youth in foster care that need access to gender affirming care, um, which at the time, this was late 2023, early 2024, was much more possible than it is right now. So my project changed a lot after I started. Um, and so, but at the time, I was really trying to come up with strategies that were going to be new and novel and something that I could really take ownership over. Um, and I think I've implemented my project pieces pretty successfully, but if it helps, funders and funding organizations know that you sometimes you get into the job and things change in the world and you can't necessarily do exactly what you put on paper. Like obviously do everything you can to do what's on paper, but um if you get into your position and you're like, "Oh, I don't know if the strategy is going to work as well as I thought." They're not going to come back and take your money. So, um think that is everything on my fellowship journey. I can pass it along.
Happy to talk about my journey. Uh, Context, law school was a career change for me. I ran an LGBTQ center prior to law school, and that's what encouraged me to go and decide to shift my role in the movement. So I came into law school very laser focused that I wanted to do impact litigation and policy and for queer orgs, and I was not interested in anything else. So that's context for my journey. I interned at Lambda during my 1L summer, which, as a note, is certainly not a requirement, I think, for any fellowship that you intern there. For me, it was really helpful because there's no other lawyers in my family, and it was helpful being in an org and kind of getting a grasp of how things work. And I also walked away from that internship being like, I would really like to work there someday. So that was helpful context for me. Um, as I was approaching um, my 2L summer, I was trying to clerk in addition to doing fellowships. And a lot of the fellowships are on different cycles of each other, right? Some of them are 2 years, some of them are 1 year. So there's some years that Lambda's hiring that the ACLU is not, and vice versa. So for me, my timing wanted that I wanted to clerk first because I was very excited about appointing Lambda. So I was extremely lucky that when I applied to clerk, I applied on the plan and I got a clerkship day. As a quick note for anyone who's interested in clerking on this call, I think it's a interesting choice to make and something that's very personal. It is not by any means required for a fellowship. A lot of the best fellows I know didn't clerk and have no interest in clerking. And also, if you're applying to clerkships and you don't get a clerkship on the plan, that's actually really normal and okay. All but like one other of my friends completely struck out on the plan and got fabulous clerkships later on. So just wanting to put all that out there. So I was very fortunate since I got a clerkship on the plan, I was able to throw my hands up and be like, I'm done. I don't have to worry about this fellowship stuff for a little while. That being said, during 3L, I like made my list of like where I wanted to go. And then during 2024 to 2025, I was clerking. Other things I did during that year is I published an article that was related to like LGBT issues and also joined and got very active on the board of the National Trans Bar Association, which are not things that are required if you're clerking and trying to be a fellow later. Just wanted to name that like there were things I was doing on the side that were related to my issue area that might have helped, maybe it didn't. Those are also things that your judge might not let you do. My judge said it was fine. So I started applying to fellowships in January because I was pretty laser focused on like only a handful of organizations, the two of them being Lambda Legal and the Williams Institute. Both of those are internally funded, so I wasn't even thinking about Skadden or EJW. I applied to them. I had my first interview for both of them in February. In March, I had my second interview with Lambda Legal. And then I got a really fun email from the Williams Institute, who again are hosted out of UCLA, that all of the UC system was going to have a hiring freeze because Trump was threatening some funding stuff, not in small part because of trans issues. So they actually were not able to hire a fellow that year because of that. So at that point, I'm doing my third and fourth Lambda interviews. I'm also in the background panicking because this is my only option. So at the same time, I was applying for like a lot of backup jobs, which again to say like a lot of this stuff is a gamble. So just make sure you're making some good choices. And then in May, I received my acceptance for Lambda and started later that September. So Angela talked about like different interview processes earlier in this presentation. What I'll say for Lambda is there was not a lot of skill-based things that I had to do, but I did do 4 interviews, which is a lot. And a lot of the same questions are being asked in those interviews, but that doesn't make it any less of like a nerve-wracking experience. But fortunately, there was no like having to do like a live writing sample or things like that. But yeah, that was my experience.
I'm happy to talk about mine. So, and I'll try to keep it quick. I'm cognizant of time. 2L Spring, like the others have said, I also started having conversations with organizations about being a potential fellow. This included places that I had previously worked, such as the ACLU, and also places where I hadn't worked there or had any connections with anyone, but knew that they did the kind of work I was interested in and was just curious what kind of needs they had as an organization that could be the basis for a good project. In June, I had a very intense week in June where I applied to clerkships on the plan, which I saw Q&A. Basically, the plan is just a really condensed time where a bunch of judges agree to only hire rising 3Ls to be clerks starting on like whatever the second Monday in June at 12 p.m. interviews can start. And then that week tends to be quite intense if you are getting interviews. So I got 2 clerkships on the plan. I tried to structure them to be 2 years out so that I could have a 2-year gap to be eligible for 2-year funding opportunities. Your mileage may vary on this. Like, it might be easier to clerk straight out of law school and then apply for fellowships, but I really was enjoying the relationships I had with some of the nonprofits that I wanted to fellow at and didn't want them to forget about me in a couple years. So that was part of my rationale for wanting to do that work immediately. So after I accepted my clerkships, I moved right into applying to fellowships. Some of this was coterminous, but it mostly picked up post-plan. So I didn't have any time to celebrate. And then I accepted my offer with the ACLU in July, and then we sort of immediately jumped into workshopping my application. I had pitched various projects to various nonprofits while applying, and we had to do sort of a hard reset. We had a brief informal chat with the director of the Skadden Foundation about my plan. We have a previous Skadden fellow who's now a staff attorney on my team, and she said that my project, which was originally focused on trans youth in schools, wasn't poverty law, which is the superstructure of the Skadden Fellowship. Your client population is supposed to be primarily indigent. So we reevaluated and thought about what other needs the project has that might serve a primarily indigent population, and that's how we reached what my project ended up becoming, which was a focus on Medicaid restrictions and public funding for gender affirming care. And that is now sort of what I do, but also in light of this looming Medicaid rule is not really what I do. So things evolve. So I applied to Skadden and EJW. For what it's worth, I found the EJW application helpful in getting my Skadden application together. EJW asked for a very detailed 2-year timeline. So that level of detail actually makes it easier to write the sort of more high-level essays for Skadden, at least in my experience, and also did the JC prospectus. Did my interview, got notified I was a finalist, and then once I got notified that I was a Skadden fellow, I was able to withdraw my fellowship applications and was just done, which was great. So the chaotic June turned into a peaceful rest of 3L.
All right, so I'm a fellow now with GLAD Law, but I actually interned with them my 2L summer, and I believe Alex also interned at the ACLU beforehand. So people keep in mind for your summer internship opportunities, if it's an organization that you think you might want to work with, I really think that's the best way to get your foot in the door. Also, because GLAD Law wasn't sort of soliciting opportunities to sponsor fellows. It was just sort of organic thing that I proposed to our legal director after the first half of our summer and having such an incredible time there. So I did sort of apply to a couple fellowship sponsorship opportunities, but when I got the go ahead from GLAD that they were willing to sponsor me, I withdrew from those and sort of did the whole host of externally funded fellowships. And to Charlie's point about handling rejection, I applied to Skadden and interviewed and then didn't get it. I also applied to EJW and actually got interviewed in April, to Isaiah's point about the sort of long timeline in which they interview people. But I ended up applying for the Lyman Law Fellowship, which is a public interest fellowship at my law school, and accepted that. And I knew I wanted to do a fellowship right after law school, so I actually didn't apply for clerkships on the plan. So once I got my fellowship funding secured, which was in March of my 3L spring, I then shifted to applying for clerkships, which is nice because you can sort of do it at your own pace. And I will say that there has been a increase in the number of judges who really value having work experience, and oftentimes some judges who put special emphasis on public interest work experience, particularly those judges that come from a public interest background. So to Charlie's point, I actually think, sometimes it could benefit you to applying after you have sort of a fellowship in place, which you can talk about in your applications. And what was great about my fellowship is that there was an opportunity it was a 1-year fellowship with the opportunity to renew it for an additional year, which was just granted in January of this year. So I'll be spending 1 more year here at GLAD before clerking beginning in August of 2027. I'll pass it to Angela.
Sorry, y'all, this unmute button. All right, I'm going to be quick because I know we don't have a lot of time left, but so I applied on plan in the summer. After my 2L year, I applied to a mix of state and federal clerkships. I applied to like about 30. My clerkships office at my law school said to apply to like 70 to 100, but that was not what I wanted to do based on, the types of judges who I wanted to clerk for or the location. And I received one interview offer, so I was rejected from all the other ones, but that was the one that mattered. I then accepted an offer to clerk on the New Jersey Supreme Court. So I would do a plug for state courts. Then after my 3L, so after I graduated, I started applying to organizations. I made my list, and that was kind of based on what my school public interest office recommended, as well as what was posted publicly online, like on idealist.org. So I first started submitting my applications in July. One hazard about applying starting in July is if they contact you around then, you might be studying for the bar exam. So my first interview was scheduled like a few days before or a few days after the bar exam, which was added to the stress, but it ended up being fine, then in August, at the end of August, my clerkship began. So, it's just kind of interesting to keep in mind that you might be applying for jobs after your clerkship before you've even started your clerkship if you have a similar timeline to me, but that's just the name of the game. And then in November, I got an acceptance at GLAD Law. It was only one round of interviews, and after that, I withdrew my other fellowship applications I submitted. So in total, I applied to about 10 fellowships. I was really only targeting the internally funded ones. I interviewed for 4, was rejected from a couple of them, and then was lucky enough to get this GLAD Law fellowship. So that was my timeline. I didn't apply to as many places as my career services office may have recommended, but it ended up being okay. Great. So I think we have a few minutes for questions.
Yeah, so we've tried to go and answer questions as they've come in, but if other folks have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. One that I'll quickly add, because I'm not seeing any come in yet. I'm actually going to give folks 2 options for a question. First is, all of us experience rejection during our application process. How did you handle that? And the other question I'll ask is, all of us members of the community, how did that feel as you were going through like this process? Like, in what ways were you showing up, and like how were you taking care of yourself and being authentic during your application process? Keeping in mind that we only have 2 minutes, so be quick. I'll call on people.
I can start just because I had a couple of projections throughout my process, but like what I tried to keep in mind is often like these, especially for external funded fellowships, like they're looking for particular types of fellowship projects, and just because you're not selected doesn't mean that you're not deserving or that your fellowship project isn't important. It just could mean that they it didn't fit the sort of projects that they were looking for that specific year. There are specific, like Alex said, Skadden usually deals with projects with indigent people, and as Isaiah said, the Justice Catalyst perspective will just tell you this just does not fit the type of fellowships that we want to fund this year. So I really encourage people not to take it personally. And if you're really passionate about your project, that will come through, and like hopefully you'll be rewarded for like pursuing what you're passionate about. And yeah, just encourage everyone to stick with it. It can be grueling, but I think it's worth it.
I know we're at time, but I just wanted to add that I also thought my Skadden interview went horrible. I had technical issues halfway through and had to switch from video to phone and forgot to say half the things I was planning to, and it all worked out. So it's a stressful process, and it's hard to do this work, but ultimately the process pales in comparison to getting to work with these people on these issues. And I hope that everyone joins this community.
If it's okay, if I say one more thing before we end, I also want to acknowledge that it can be really hard to kind of put a lot of yourself and your personal experiences into these applications and then have them be rejected. It can feel really, really destabilizing. And I just want to assure you that that's okay, and that doesn't mean that the things that you've shared and the experiences you bring to your work don't matter, because they really, really do. It just wasn't the right opportunity at the right time. Your story matters more than what funders think.
So, some of the question I know that I asked. For folks on the call who are members of the communities, if you're thinking about LGBT fellowships in particular, I think having your own set of boundaries is really, really important. I think something that is unique about public interest jobs versus going to a law firm, which I don't particularly care for, is it often feels like we are required to talk about our lived experiences or identities or our trauma during internships, or to apply for internships or to apply for fellowships. So as I was going through that process, I was very clear with myself about like, okay, I want to show up very authentically as myself. Like I'm not being stealth. And also there are things that I know would probably help me in this interview, maybe, but I am not going to say because it's not a future employer's business. This work can be very personal for some of us, for all of us. So I think having your own concept around like your own boundaries to keep yourself authentic, but also sustainable and healthy during this process is really, really important. Great. If there's nothing anyone else wants to add, just want to say thanks everyone for coming today. It's been a real delight, and I hope this is helpful. Our contact information is on the slide, so feel free to screen the shot. And if you have follow-up questions, let us know. Like we said, none of us did this in a vacuum. So lean on your people, and good luck. You're going to be great.
On behalf of the National LGBTQ Bar, thank you again for coming, and thank you to our wonderful panel. This truly was so helpful, so much good information that I wish I had as a law student, and I'm sure this will be really helpful to folks for years to come. For everyone on the call, like I said, this was recorded, so we'll get that uploaded and send it around to everyone who's registered, along with some resources. And I also just want to thank everyone for plugging Lavender Law. I can attest to how wonderful Lavender Law is, even though I'm a bit biased as somebody who puts it on. And I'll share information about that conference as well and follow-up emails with all of the attendees today. So thank you all so much and have a wonderful rest of your day.